We ranked the 64 songs of Steely Dan's classic period. Now, let's see how the album catalog stacks up. 9 studio albums, and we're going to put them in order. But of course, you know that. That's why you're here. Hey there, Swan Shadow here. Welcome back to the nest. I had promised that we would return to our Steely Dan ranking project with a focus on the albums. By the end of this video, that promise will be kept. As was the case when we looked at Donald Fagen and Walter Becker's 64 songs released between 1972 and 1980, there's not a single bad record among their 9 studio albums, including the 2 reunion albums released in the early 2000s. However, as much as I love this entire body of work, I do enjoy some of Steely Dan's albums more than others. So I'm going to rank these 9 albums in the order of my personal preference. The only criterion I've employed is how I feel about this music. This is not qualitative analysis. It's what album do I enjoy listening to more or less than another. What I invite you to do is put your ranking down below in the comments section. I'm very curious to see how you arrange these albums according to your preference. Are you and I going to agree on every album? Probably not. That's how music works. It hits our ears and our hearts differently. I started this process by generating an average song score for each of the 7 classic period albums. I simply added up the placement numbers for each song based on where they ranked in my list of 64, and then divided that number by the total number of tracks on each album. But then I reminded myself, songs are one thing, albums are entirely another. I needed to arrange the albums based on how I feel about the total musical package and not allow an outlier song or two to throw off the proper order. So I had to make a couple of tweaks to that original listing. Plus, I had to fit in the 2 reunion albums whose songs I didn't include among the 64 that I ranked previously. Now I have an order that I believe more accurately represents my feelings about each of these 9 albums. At least, these are my feelings today. Ask me tomorrow and things could change. All that said, let's chop it up. Here is my Steely Dan album, number 9. At the bottom of my album ranking, something's got to bring up the rear, right? Is Becker and Fagen's final studio collaboration, Everything Must Go, released in 2003. This one will not come as a shock to anyone who's watched my recent video in which I discussed this album. And if you haven't watched that video, what are you waiting for? Everything Must Go is, in my opinion, the weakest entry in the Steely Dan discography. No, I take that back. It's the only weak entry in the Steely Dan discography. Weak is relative because this is still Steely Dan we're talking about, but weak compared to the rest of the catalog. Although everything on Everything Must Go is well composed and competently performed, at least a couple of the songs, I'm thinking of Slang of Ages and Blues Beach in particular, should have been left on the cutting room floor. And the entire album just reeks of, we're out of here. The few highlights, which are basically the last 3 tracks on the album, can't keep this one out of last place. And it's not even close. In 8th place is Countdown to Ecstasy, Steely Dan's 2nd studio album, released in 1973. Until the first time I heard Everything Must Go, I would have thought it would be impossible for Becker and Fagen to lead a Steely Dan album that I enjoyed less than Countdown to Ecstasy. Now, in Countdown's defense, there isn't a single bad song on it. In fact, the track that I ranked the lowest from this album, Pearl of the Quarter, came in at number 52 out of 64 classic period songs. So it's not even in the bottom 10. It's just that I find the overall tone of the album not to be what I most love about Steely Dan. There's simply not enough excitement on this record for me, and apparently for a lot of other people, given that this was the lowest selling of any of the group's classic period albums. It should be noted, though, that my number 3 Steely Dan song of all time, My Old School, is on this album. Any record with that song, as well as Showbiz Kids, deserves a place in anyone's music collection. In 7th place, we have the debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill, released in 1972. The only thing wrong with Can't Buy a Thrill, really, is that it's a first effort, and it feels like one. Fagen and Becker hadn't yet completely figured out what they wanted Steely Dan to be, or to sound like. So this first album is, well, kind of all over the place. That doesn't make it a bad album in any respect. In fact, the variety of musical influences on Can't Buy a Thrill was a significant part of what made it so successful. Sure, we've all heard Do It Again and Reelin' in the Years far more times than we ever needed to, but those are still landmark tracks. So are songs like Midnight Cruiser, Kings, and Dirty Work. This was fresh and amazing stuff in 1972, and it still holds up to scrutiny today. In 6th place is Pretzel Logic, Steely Dan's 3rd studio album, released in 1974. This one makes me sad because Pretzel Logic was the album that got me into Steely Dan originally, and for a long time, it was my favorite Steely Dan album. But there are just too many short songs on the second side of the original vinyl that drag the effort down just a peg or two for me as I listen to it today. But man, what an incredible start that album gets off to. Ricky Don't Lose That Number, Night by Night, Any Major Dude Will Tell You, and Barrytown. Some artists would kill to put 4 songs that great on one album, much less right in a row to start the record. And then later we get the spectacular title track, Pretzel Logic. From that point, the album is solid gold. In a surprising, to me anyway, 5th place is the first of the 2 reunion albums, Two Against Nature, released in 2000. I will admit I was not a huge fan of this album when it was first released, and not for many years afterward. But it has grown on me over time, as I noted in my recent video where I discussed this album in detail. Of the 9 tracks on Two Against Nature, there's really only one, the unfortunately titled Negative Girl, that wouldn't rank in the upper 2/3 if I had included these songs in my overall ranking. And a few of them, Jack of Speed, What a Shame About Me, Almost Gothic, maybe West of Hollywood, and the Grammy-winning single Cousin Dupree. All of those would probably be in the mix with the top half, which, for an album I wasn't crazy about a quarter century ago, is a pretty remarkable achievement. Coming in at the 4th spot is Katy Lied, the 4th Steely Dan studio album, released in 1975. Of all the albums in the Steely Dan discography, Katy Lied is the one that stands out as being better than the sum of its component parts. There are 3 true standout tracks on this album: Dr. Wu, my number 7 Steely Dan song overall, Black Friday, and Bad Sneakers, which are all in my top 20. But even the lesser efforts on Katy Lied, and there are a few of them, fit inextricably into the zeitgeist of the album. It's the first recording that is 100% in the post-band era of Steely Dan. And so much of the album reflects the direction into which Becker and Fagen were evolving. This is, of course, the album that the boys from Bard famously could never bring themselves to listen to once it was finished, due to some technical issues in the recording process. But it sounds fantastic to my untrained ears. That's why it's my number 4. Landing at number 3 in my ranking is Gaucho, the 7th and final of the classic period albums, released in 1980. I can still recall how eagerly I slapped my newly purchased vinyl copy of Gaucho on the little turntable in my college dorm room shortly before Thanksgiving break in the fall of 1980. 3 long years had passed since the previous Steely Dan album had come out, and I couldn't wait to hear what Becker and Fagen had been doing in the time since. From the opening notes of Babylon Sisters, it was clear that the wait had been worthwhile. Now, I know that to some fans, Gaucho is just a little too slick, a little too glossy, a little too refined and emotionally removed, and I get that. And yes, there are a couple of tracks that don't rank with the best that Steely Dan had to offer. But any album with songs like Hey 19, a top 5 Steely Dan track in my estimation, Time Out of Mind, and the title number, Gaucho, well, an album like that simply can't be denied. In the number 2 slot, and I really struggled with this one, is Asia, the 6th studio album, released in 1977. This is so tough because I'm not sure it's humanly possible to make a more perfect album than Asia. Seriously, it sounds totally brilliant, even almost 50 years after its creation. 6 of its 7 tracks are nothing short of genius. And the one lesser track, I Got the News, is a song that any pop rock band would be proud to have on their resume. Deacon Blues and Black Cow both made my top 10. Peg just missed at number 12. And Deacon Blues avoided being chosen as my favorite Steely Dan song of all time pretty much by a coin flip. So then, why isn't Asia my number 1 album? It could be. On any other day, it might be. If it's number 1 on your list, you are undeniably correct in making that choice. But by the most microscopic of razor-thin margins, there's one Steely Dan album that, at least for today, squeaks in ever so slightly ahead. Coming in at number 1 in my ranking of Steely Dan studio albums is The Royal Scam, the 5th album, released in 1976. For me, the element that gets The Royal Scam the nod, and again, it's just by a hair's breadth, is that it rocks a little bit harder and boasts just a little bit more sonic variety than Asia. Both albums landed 4 songs in my top 20. Home at Last on Asia just missed at number 21. But The Royal Scam leads off with my number 1, Kid Charlemagne, which is the most incendiary kickoff for any album in the Steely Dan catalog, a band noted for dynamite album starters. And it has that rip-roaring Larry Carlton guitar solo, which just might be the greatest guitar solo ever put to record. So many stellar tracks: The Caves of Altamira, The Fez, Haitian Divorce, Don't Take Me Alive. And no other act at the time or since could have expanded genres and mixed and matched styles and textures the way Donald Fagen and Walter Becker did on this album. It might not be quite as perfect as Asia, but what record could be? Yet, when it comes to Steely Dan albums, The Royal Scam is my number 1. Unless it's Asia. Did I mess this up? As promised, that's my ranking of the 9 studio albums by the legendary, the incomparable Steely Dan. How close is my ranking to yours? Which album is your top pick? And where do you slot in the others? Post your list in the comments below. I'm always excited to see what other fans hear in this remarkable music. And if you haven't already watched my other Steely Dan videos, there's a playlist linked below to make the ride easy. Before you head out, please take a moment to give this video a little thumbs up. And if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, come on now. It's one click of a button, and it's 100% cost and risk-free. Plus, it helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, and I know you want to help. We've got all kinds of fascinating explorations in the hopper, so you might want to ring that notification bell so that the old tube will hit you up when it's time to watch. Until your next trip to the nest, be well and stay steely. And keep asking the question, is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car.